distributing the RSVPs. If you know some of your classmates that said, oh, I wished I would have attended, let them know. We're happy to have them sign up for the future ones and continue to expose you to different career paths that maybe don't fully line up with all the classes that you're taking. And our hope is to one, expose you to what you can do with a Doctor of Pharmacy degree, and then secondarily help you build some personal connections and some your professional network that will expand as time goes forward. And this is a great example. Gordon Ingle, as I introduce him, I'll actually introduce him through my sort of personal and professional network. So he and I were actually pharmacy students at the same time here in Beard Hall. And as I chose to move my clinical training into the East Coast, he decided he wanted to go out to the West Coast. And so he was trained as a solid organ transplant pharmacist. And that was back when it was just an emerging area. He practiced for many, many years in the health system setting and then moved into the pharmaceutical industry and has had a varied numbers of careers. He now currently lives in Las Vegas. And so I'll let you talk about his careers, but Gordon, it's been great to have you. Thanks for coming all the way from the West Coast to join us here in person.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Always good to come back to Chapel Hill. Certainly feel a little nostalgic when I come back here. I'm from Winston-Salem originally, and then obviously went to school here, both for my BS and my PharmD. But you know, one of the things that I kind of got into when I was in pharmacy is really, I always kind of thought I'd kind of go into that academic medicine and academic PharmD kind of routes. But, you know, as we'll go through here in a minute, I kind of changed paths about, 7 or 8 years into my career. And I've been working in the pharmaceutical industry now for 15 plus years. So the one thing that I didn't really get a lot when I was here is what opportunities there really are in the pharmaceutical industry. And so, doing the things that I have done, I really didn't even know that that was even a possibility when I was, sitting in Beard Hall, learning all of our therapeutics and so forth. So, so what I want to do today is really try to open some opportunities for what PharmDs can do in the pharmaceutical industry, and kind of go through what I have done, and try to show that path and hopefully give you guys some guidance on what you can potentially do with your degree. Because the PharmD degree really does provide a lot of opportunity within the pharmaceutical industry. So the first picture I just kind of put up there is, a bunch of medicines on shelves in an actual pharmacy. And before these medicines can actually make it to those shelves, there have been a lot of people, a lot of projects, a lot of successful projects, all along the continuum before that it can actually make it to that shelf, before a patient can actually take it. And we'll go through some of these, but the PharmDs can truly help all along that continuum prior to these medicines making it to the shelf. And I think this is really where the opportunities arise within the pharmaceutical industry. So what opportunities are there? I've listed out a lot of them here. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, but these are just some of the things that I thought of when I was just kind of putting down one slide. So medical affairs is big with PharmDs, field medical science liaisons. I was one of those. We'll talk about that. But also in field medical, there's leadership, there's managers of MSLs, there's national directors of medical science liaisons and a field medical. So there's multiple different layers kind of within that field medical group. Medical information and communication, or drug information, being able to provide appropriate drug information for people when they call and want information. Health economics and outcomes research, outcomes research, operations, training and development, where you're just training other folks to make sure that they're successful in their jobs. Drug safety, patient advocacy is really coming along strong now. Making sure that the patient's voice is within everything you do within the pharmaceutical industry, medical writing, protocols, things like that. Then on the commercial side, there's obviously sales, folks who are actually in the field doing sales of drugs and medications and marketing of that, folks who kind of work more in-house and developing the strategies for what the sales folks need to be able to do. Leadership, executive leadership, you know, high up in organizations. And we'll talk about this in a minute, but I worked at Novartis for several years. And I always tell people the guy who was one rung below the CEO, you know, in 140,000 people who worked for Novartis was a pharmacist. So, you know, that level, you can get into that level of executive leadership. Clinical development, this is really focusing much more on the clinical trials, and I worked in clinical development as well, being, you know, multiple layers of a medical director, and being able to really push through all of the clinical trials, associate medical directors, senior executive medical directors. There's multiple different layers kind of within clinical development, project management, data managers, clinical pharmacology, all part of clinical development where PharmDs can play a role. Regulatory affairs and interactions with the FDA and other regulatory bodies around the world. Clinical operations, really the operational aspects of clinical trials. And then basic science, you know, research, you know, proof of concept studies, preclinical studies with animal studies, all of that. I've known PharmDs to be a part of that. So again, lots of different opportunities kind of within for PharmDs within the pharmaceutical or biotech industry. So we'll kind of get into how I got into the pharmaceutical industry. And as Stephen mentioned, I started off in transplant. So I was doing my PharmD rotations. You know, I didn't get all of my first choices. I was always kind of good in immunology. So one of my second choices, one of my alternate choices was transplant. And actually I got transplant here. I was in this AHEC, you know, in Durham, Chapel Hill, Raleigh. And Bob Dupuy was my preceptor. So I go on rotation and absolutely loved it. You know, absolutely loved, you know, the impact of what PharmDs can truly have. All patients take immunosuppression. Because of that, they have infectious complications and diabetes and hypertension. And there's a lot of all these other medicine aspects to transplant. But the biggest thing was really just what a new organ does for not just one person, but their whole family, you know, their friends and family. One organ truly is a lifesaver for multiple people. So I really felt like that would be a big impact for me. So, you know, I remember I'm walking around the halls and you know, in the hospital over here and thinking, well, maybe I should, you know, do transplant. Maybe that's what I should do. So, you know, I knew I wanted to do a residency, do like a PGY1 general residency. So I was interested in learning more about healthcare outside of North Carolina because I grew up here, obviously went to school here. So I looked for more residencies outside of North Carolina. And ultimately, I matched at Cedars-Sinai in Los Angeles. So when that letter came, I said, I'm moving to LA now. So pack up my bags and I moved to California. So, but the whole idea really is like, you know, my career path is going to be that academic transplant PharmD, you know, I'll be another Bob Dupuy, if you will, you know? And so that's really what I was kind of looking for in my career. So I did my PGY1 residency at Cedars, lots of new opportunities. I had one rotation where I had to do in transplant, and then I had another, you know, elective rotation. I did another month in transplant. I did my residency research project. Ultimately, I did that in kidney transplant. And then, you know, the interesting part was when I kind of first started, it was my second month at Cedars, and I'm on kidney transplant. And I have my little, you know, UNC pin on my white coat. And the medical director for kidney transplant was like, oh, North Carolina, oh, that's a good school. And I was like, oh, thanks, you know, out here in LA. So we started talking. He's from the mountains of North Carolina. He went to medical school here. And so, you know, I had that Tar Heel connection. He was super helpful in my career. He, you know, allowed me to do my prospective, you know, research project in kidney transplant. So super supportive. Anything I kind of wanted to do, he was there to kind of support me. So I kind of said, all right, this is really what I want to do. I want to do transplant. You know, that's what I'm going to go into. So I talked to Bob Dupuy. He knew the transplant PharmD over at UCLA. And he said he usually has a fellowship. So then I was like, do I want to do another couple of years? You know, I've already been in school forever and I've already done this residency. Do I want to spend 2 more years doing a fellowship? But ultimately I decided, yes, you know, I'm going to do my residency or do a fellowship and kind of learn more about being an academic PharmD at UCLA. And so that worked out well. Went over to UCLA. UCLA and Cedars are probably 10 or 15 minutes apart, depending on traffic, of course, in LA. But it was one of the biggest, and still is one of the biggest transplant programs in the United States. You know, we were doing 200 livers at the time. We were doing over 300 kidneys, 100 hearts, 60 lungs. I mean, it was, in the amount of time that you're there, in a small amount of time, you get to see more than most programs see in several years. So it was a really good opportunity for me to get a really good experience. And again, kind of that networking aspect is really important because, you know, Bob introduced me to Curtis Holt, who is my fellowship director. So that kind of kept things going in that transplant realm. So then I interviewed for a bunch of jobs outside of California. Didn't like all the weather. I loved the weather in LA. So I decided to stay at UCLA. So I stayed on there for another few years, working, you know, in transplant. And then one of my my mentors from Cedars, he and some of his colleagues opened and founded a new school of pharmacy in Nevada. And so they needed sites. They needed sites to be able to send their students. So there was another larger kidney transplant program in LA that had a lot of kidney transplants. They didn't really do a lot of liver or heart transplants, but we went over to the director of pharmacy there and said, hey, what about a clinical transplant PharmD, just focusing on that, take students, teach at the school. So that kind of fell into place, and I worked with, at that time it was called the University of Southern Nevada, now it's called Roseman University. So I would teach like immunology, and I would teach renal failure and transplant and things like that, didactic at the school. I would have students come on rotation with me. And then obviously I had my practice, you know, in-house, you know, at St. Vincent Medical Center. Again, we were doing close to 300 kidneys at that time. So it was a busy program. So doing research, doing clinical stuff, having students, you know, that academic route, you know, that's kind of the route I was on. And then one day, my sales reps, of all things, from Novartis, come to my office and they say, hey, you know, we don't want you to get mad at us, but we want to talk to you about something. And I'm like, I'm not going to get mad at you. What do you want to talk about? So they said, all right, we've got this new field medical team that we're starting at Novartis in transplant. We've done it before in other therapeutic areas. You know, they had it in like cardiology and hypertension and things like that, but they'd never done it in transplant. And they're like, you know, we think you'd be great for it. So I'm like, you know, I'm happy where I'm at. I had the best, you know, medical team, you know, people that I still keep up with at St. Vincent. So I was like, you know, but part of professional development, you need to figure out what opportunities are out there. So I sent in my CV. They called me like the next day on Friday. They said, hey, come in on Monday. I'm in LA. They're in New Jersey. My manager is gone for the day. He's gone on Friday. So I leave him a voice message saying, hey, I'm not going to be here on Monday. I'll tell you about it when I get back. And he's was really cool about it. You know, he was extremely supportive. So I go and I do these interviews and I talk to everybody, and they seem like they're interested. But then when you work in, again, this was at Novartis, so, you know, it's a big pharmaceutical company. And so things move kind of slow. So I thought they were interested, but never really heard anything back. So I was like, all right, you know, no big deal. I'm still happy where I'm at. So I got but then I got the call saying, hey, we're going to give you an offer. And so then, you know, there I was like, what do I do? Should I switch or should I stay? You know? And so it was a lot of discussion. I talked to, you know, friends and family and colleagues and things like that. But ultimately I said, you know, I think this is going to be a good opportunity for me because A, it's in transplant, which I love. B, it's going to be in an area where there's not been anybody before. So I can kind of build my own territory, build my own kind of practice, if you will, in and around transplant. Plus, I'll be able to help, when you're working one-on-one with patients, you're helping ones, each one you're helping. But when you go into the pharmaceutical industry, you're helping much more people on a much broader scale. So if you're involved with a drug which makes it to market and ultimately improves outcomes for transplant patients, you're helping many more patients than you do kind of individually. So I thought about all of that, and it's obviously a lifestyle change for me because I'm in traffic for a good hour and a half each way, and so it's a lifestyle change. And so ultimately I said, yeah, let me make this switch and move over to Novartis, still being in transplant. So I took the job in field medical, and I was a medical science liaison. So medical science liaisons are popular, I would say, amongst PharmDs, and it's probably a good avenue to kind of get into the pharmaceutical industry for PharmDs. MSLs are really the field-based experts in their therapeutic area. So I go into this thinking, okay, I know transplant, I know immunosuppression. I can go talk to people about, immunosuppression medicines and all that kind of stuff. I can do this. But the one thing I really didn't get a good feel for is truly what the job is. And the job really more is developing relationships. It's a relationship type of job. It's not how much transplant I know. I mean, you gotta have the baseline understanding what transplant is, because you're going and talking to the leading transplant surgeons and physicians in your territory. So you gotta make sure you know your stuff. But so much of it is developing relationships. And I feel like a lot of the pharmaceutical industry is based off relationships. So it's not just your external relationships with people, that you're working with, your physicians and so forth, but it's also, internal relationships, because you got to be able to get projects done, and you have to have relationships internally for people to be able to fund things and so forth. So much of the job I learned is really developing relationships. So I say that because networking is huge. And in the pharmaceutical industry, you want to get to know people. You got to talk to people. You got to be active. If you want to get into the pharmaceutical industry, you got to network. And to me, that is one of the things that I had to learn. I got my foot in the door just because I knew transplant. I had worked at 3 different transplant centers in LA. They're like, okay, he knows people at those centers. Those are big centers. That will be helpful. So, that's kind of what got my foot in the door. But networking is huge. Other things that you kind of work with, medical strategy, as you kind of progress in your career, you get involved in the teams and the committees which make the decisions on where do you focus your time and energy, and the things that you're supposed to say and the things that you're supposed to do, really kind of developing a strategic mindset. And so that's something that's unique and different that you usually don't kind of get in school either. So kind of developing all of that. Clinical trials are huge. Being able to support clinical trials, doing investigator-initiated studies, which I had done on the other side, but now I was helping support other folks to be able to do that. Cross-functional collaboration, as I was mentioning, kind of that internal networking, being able to do all that. And then compliance. That was another whole world to me when you go into the pharmaceutical industry, is things that you can and can't say, things you can and can't do. My first week or two at Novartis, I'm like, what the hell did I just do? Like, I can't say or do anything. I can't just put together some slides like I did here and come talk. You got to put slides together. You got to people to review them, and this committee reviews them, send them back to you. A month later, you got the slides that you can actually go talk to people about. So compliance is huge, and it never gets any less. It's always more and more compliance. And then companies, especially big companies like Novartis, will take it to another level, so that you're not setting yourself up for any issues kind of from a compliance standpoint. So that part of it is big as well. So was really enjoying my time as an MSL. It's a great job. It truly is. The flexibility that you have, the people that you meet, the networking that you do, the exposure that you get was amazing. I know people at transplant centers pretty much throughout the United States, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been into the pharmaceutical industry. So kind of the next step that I took, there was an opportunity that opened up in it was the transplant and hepatology area of clinical development at Novartis. And again, clinical development is focusing on the clinical trials. So at Novartis, they had a Novartis Institute of Biomedical Research, which did all the basic science and the proof of concept stuff. Then once it was ready to go into, whatever therapeutic area that is, for me, it was transplant or in hepatology. Then it came to us in like phase 2. So in clinical development, I was a clinical research medical director. Ultimately became the lead for the transplant U.S. clinical development group in transplants at Novartis. And we were developing an anti-CD40 monoclonal antibody for immunosuppression, trying to do CNI-free immunosuppression in both liver and kidney transplants. So we were developing it for both of those. So really got involved in all of the strategy, developing the ideas of how do we focus our time, which sites do we go to, how do we get our patients enrolled, all of that kind of stuff, making sure that we're hitting all these, tight timelines that pharmaceutical companies always put on you, because time is money. The sooner you can get a drug out, the better you are. And clinical development is a money spender. We spend money. We don't make money. We spend it, So being able to do everything, very effectively is important. Protocol development, investigator engagement, scientific oversight, all of these things are extremely important in making sure that the study itself runs according to plan, and then everything follows all the protocols and everything is appropriate, because you got to have good data at the end. It may not always be positive data, but you always want to have at least, good data kind of on the way in. Medical monitoring is also important. That's really when the sites have questions, medical questions, clinical questions about what do I do in this situation? I have a patient that's got this, what should I do? And you can't play clinician with them, but you can help guide them. It's ultimately their decisions. We can't make those decisions for them, but you can help guide them on that. And so again, that's some more of the clinical aspects of these types of jobs. Data interpretation and analysis also extremely important. So with that, I was getting a lot more experience kind of specifically on the clinical development side. So then I got a call from a recruiter, and they said, we've got this company, this transplant company that's developing this cell therapy. It's not a medication, it's a cell therapy, stem cell-based cell therapy to try to develop immunologic tolerance in living donor kidney transplant. So I didn't, I was like, I didn't know who the company was. I'd never heard of Talaris. But then I'd kind of heard of the cell therapy. So then I asked, I was like, are these people working for that company? They're like, yeah. And I was like, oh, I worked with them at Novartis. So again, the networking aspect of that really helped, because then when the recruiter presented my CV, they're like, oh, we know Gordon, So, it was much easier for me going through the interview process when people already knew me. So then that job, Talaris is a small biotech company, about 100 people, completely opposite of Novartis, 100,000 versus 100. Focus 100% on this one cell therapy. So we have one cell therapy that, if it works, fantastic. If it doesn't, then you're out of luck, right? So I was hired to lead the phase 3 trial. So we had some good phase 2 data with this cell therapy. 70% of the patients came off of immunosuppression in that phase 2 study without rejecting. I mean, that to me is amazing if you know transplant at all. So to me, to be a part of that and to be able to lead a phase 3 program for that would be a huge feather in my cap. And again, sitting where you guys are, when I was sitting there, no idea that I would even, I could even have this kind of job, with no idea that that was even an opportunity or an option for me. So I was hired to lead the phase 3 program, and with that, you have to interact with everybody. You have to interact with, all the data people. You got to interact with your operations folks. You got to interact with your medical affairs folks. You got to interact with the manufacturing people who manufacture these stem cells. And so it's a huge collaboration running a full phase 3 program. So you get a lot more kind of expertise in and around the construct of a clinical trial, regulatory information, writing protocols, doing investigator brochures, all of those types of things, all the nuts and bolts. And you're focused obviously on the medical side of things. You have operations people who do a lot of the operations stuff, and you're focused kind of on the medical or the clinical side of things. So great opportunity. But when you move from a very large pharmaceutical company, which has a lot of assets and a lot of drugs, if something were to fail, and they fail more often in pharmaceutical companies than make it. So if they fail, you can go and do something else at Novartis. If they fail at Solaris, we're all looking for new jobs, right? So that's kind of what happened this year. In 2023 is they made an announcement. So our cell therapy was kind of, okay. So our cell therapy was doing okay. We had some patients coming off immunosuppression, but we did have some safety issues last year. We had a little bit more graft versus host disease in our phase 3 program than we had been seeing in our phase 2 program. So those were some of the issues. We had COVID, we had enrollment problems just because it's an extremely complex study. You're basically doing a stem cell transplant the day after a living donor kidney transplant, which is, you don't do that normally. Like stem cell people don't talk to kidney transplant people in a medical center. So it's an extremely complex study. So enrollment was lagging. And so ultimately at the beginning of this year, Solaris made the announcement that we're going to shut all the programs down. So, that's part of working in clinical development, right? High risk, high reward. So they announced in June that Solaris is going to reverse merge into a private company, and that private company now will become public. So it's basically a merger of two small companies to make it like the new company. And that new company has stuff in thyroid eye disease and has their own, team already in place and so forth. So there I am. What am I going to do? So what I decided to do was take the summer off. So I haven't had a summer off since I was 13 years old. I worked from 14 every summer at Carolina. I worked every summer after I got out of Carolina. So I said, I'm going to not work. And so the good thing though, is I have been saving for a long time, financially making the right decisions kind of all along the way, that I don't feel like I have to, jump right back into things and, need a job. So what I decided to do here is, this is in Nepal at Mount Everest. So this right up here at the top, this mountain that looks like it's smoking with the snow blowing off of it is Mount Everest. And so Mount Everest is obviously the highest mountain in the world. I'm standing right here just above base camp. If you guys know anything about Mount Everest, I just took a screenshot of my altimeter at 17,324 feet. That's obviously higher than any mountain in the continental US. I mean, in the continental US, I think the highest mountain's like 14,000 feet. So I'm 3,000 feet above any of the highest mountains in the continental US. So amazing trip. Decided, that was a bucket list trip. Didn't know it until I did it, but highly recommend doing that. I'm not a hiker. I took a helicopter up there, so made it easy. Then I decided I'd been to pretty much every country in South America. I've been to over 50 countries, so far in my life. And I've been to every country in South America except Bolivia. So I was like, let me go to Bolivia, because I've wanted to go, I haven't had a chance. So I go to Bolivia. And so this is the Uyuni salt flats right here. And it's literally massive. I mean, this is just one side of it. I mean, it's, it used to be like a prehistoric ocean that dried up like 40 million years ago or something like that. But it's extremely flat. So you can see here, jumping up and down, me and my buddy jumping up and down here. Looks like I'm jumping, super high, but the way they makes it look, I'm jumping that high, but it's really not that high. I'm really not jumping that high, but amazing. It sits at 12,000 feet. It's all, high altitude stuff. So Bolivia was really cool too. Did a lot of other stuff as well. This is, I also went to a few weeks ago, about a month and a half ago. This is Colombia. Those cities in Colombia did that as well. So, to me, you got to turn, negatives into positives, and have been able to do some stuff that I haven't been able to do in many years. And so it's really been kind of positive. And having that, financial flexibility to be able to do that, kind of allowed me to do that, and making sure that I've been saving all along the way. So one other thing that I've been doing for like the last 4 or 5 years, there's something called the Carolina Angel Network. And this was started here at Carolina, where it was out of the business school. And the business school said, what we want to do is start an angel group that have Tar Heels invest in Tar Heels. So they basically put together, it's like investing in private equity or investing in startup type companies. So early kinds of investment. So all the people in all the investors, which is what I'm a part of, is people who either went to Carolina or have some association with Carolina. And then the companies have to be associated with Carolina somehow too, either the founder or one of the C-suite or something like that. So this has been great. I've been doing this, for 4 or 5 years, and it's been a lot of fun. Kind of like my side thing is probably my favorite kind of side thing that I've been working on. But it's really allows you to do mentorship and guidance and helping people to try to make sure that their companies are successful. Again, more networking. I've helped people kind of network throughout the pharmaceutical industry, those types of things. And obviously I make the decision if I invest, and hopefully, get my return on investment as well. So again, more higher risk, higher reward type of stuff, but a lot of fun. It's been a lot of fun. But what has really allowed me to kind of be successful in this, and where I've been kind of more of a go-to person, is my experience in the industry, understanding how to get products to market, devices, medicines, cell therapies, understanding the regulatory environments, the construct of clinical trials, timelines. Like, people have no idea about timelines of how long it takes to get stuff through. Everybody comes in thinking, oh, yeah, we'll do this and we'll be done in 2 years. And I'm like, no, you won't. So having all of that knowledge and all of that experience has been extremely helpful, that I can, help other people to kind of be able to do that. And I've gained all of that experience through my time, kind of in the pharmaceutical and the biotech industry. So that's been a lot of fun. I've had, more time to be able to work on that. I have, founders hit me up, on a pretty regular basis saying, hey, we'd just like to talk to you about our go-to-market strategy and what we're going to do. And I'm like, sure, so I spent some time with them. There's a couple of guys who, were Morehead scholars here at Carolina, and then they went to Stanford for MBA school, started this learning program, really cool learning platform. I've introduced them to a bunch of people who do like all the training at Novartis and other companies, things like that. Again, that network type of activities to really be able to help them. That's been a lot of fun. So been doing these type of things on the side, which has been a lot of fun for me when I'm not, gallivanting around the world. So I do want to kind of leave some time for questions, but always the one question that I get is, how do I get in if I don't have any experience and I don't know anybody? That's always kind of the question that I get. So to kind of start the questions off, I thought I would do this one first. So the biggest thing I think is really building a strong CV, making sure that you have all the relevant coursework and projects and research and anything that you've done that really can kind of separate yourself and show them that this is why I will qualify for this type of job, will be really important, because everybody's going to want to look at your resume, your CV. And so building your CV now and starting it now, I think, is extremely important, and having that foundation. And then as you, kind of progress, just keep putting things into your CV, and it keeps a running tab of everything that you've been working on. Next, I've mentioned this multiple times, is networking. You got to get out, go to industry events, join social media groups, talk to alumni, talk to people that that are in the industry. Really try to, talk to people and get that networking out there, because so much of it depends on that. So much of it depends on kind of who and so unless you take kind of a proactive stance on networking, having things kind of come to you first is going to be hard. Again, I got my first job at Novartis because, I was meeting with my sales folks at Novartis, and they had a job that opened up and said, "Hey, we think you'd be great for this," not knowing that I was really kind of doing that. But, that's truly how I got into the industry, was based off my experience and that networking that I had done. You always want to aim for the right jobs, especially kind of early on. There are companies that do like consulting MSLs. So they'll take an MSL, a consulting company, and they'll place you in another company for 6 months, a year, whatever. And so that's kind of like a 6 or 12-month interview, right? You go and knock it out of the park, for that 6 months or a year. No company's wanting to get rid of somebody that they really like and it's doing a really good job. So that can kind of get your foot in the door if there's something that you don't want to do. Staying up to date, obviously news and trends kind of within the industry to make sure your knowledge is always up to speed. Internships and residencies. Again, I kind of went the clinical route first, got that clinical experience, felt like more of a little bit more of an expert kind of in that transplant area, and then kind of moved into that, knew some people in LA, and then kind of moved into that. So doing, that residency and, or internship, things like that during the summer. My summers at Carolina, I did, different experiences. I did one summer I did at CVS, and it's like, I'm not going to do that ever again. I did a summer over at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. And people are like, how can you work at Duke? I'm like, they were just paying my bills. And then I worked at Glaxo one summer as well. So I tried to get different experiences kind of while I was in school also, just to kind of see what I liked. Pharmacy fellowships. Obviously, Rutgers has a really big one. That a bunch of the pharmaceutical companies are up there in New Jersey. We had several of those come through. Everybody who did a fellowship at Novartis had a job at Novartis after it was over. So those types of things, kind of getting into that. I've got a good friend who I know who did that. He lives in Charlotte. He still works for Novartis. He's been very successful with all of that. So pharmacy fellowships are a good way in, because again, it's like a year interview process. And most people will try to find you a job, after that's all over. The clinical experience, kind of the way I did it, doing the clinical experience first, and then obviously persistence, being able to always kind of keep looking, always kind of stay on top of things, always want that job search process ongoing. So you have to kind of be persistent. You can't just kind of sit back and hopefully something will fall into your lap. You want to always kind of be out there looking and being persistent, trying to find, that opportunity you think would work for you. And so I just wanted to also give my LinkedIn. If you guys want to reach out, feel free. I'll try to help you as much as I can. It's my LinkedIn profile, Gordon-Ingle on LinkedIn. So feel free to reach out if anybody needs anything, wants to talk about anything. I have extra time right now, so feel free. I'll be glad to talk to people and help out as much as I possibly can. And that's it. So if you guys have questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
Well, thank you very much, Gordon, for that presentation. Excellent overview to your career and your steps and your transitions, as well as some of the fun you had along the way.
Sure.
What questions do you have for Gordon?
Yeah.
So I'm curious to know, what did the transition in-house at Novartis look like between functional areas? Were you networking? Were you recruited to switch areas? And from there, what did that learning curve look like?
Good question. So kind of changing from field medical to the clinical research medical director, the biggest thing for me was I didn't want to move to New Jersey. So I like where I live. I don't want people telling me where I live. I can live. So I had to find a job that the managers were going to be flexible and allowing me to live where I wanted to live. So that was the biggest thing. So I did a lot of networking with people within transplant, and they're like, yeah, I moved to New Jersey to be a medical director. I'm like, I don't want to move to New Jersey. Like, you know, why can't I just live here? I'll come to New Jersey. So I found like a position that still was in transplant. That was kind of another thing, is I limit myself, right? Like, I'm only going to live where I want to live. I'm only going to work in transplant, you know, so I limit myself, but you know, that's what makes me happy. So once I finally found that position, you know, I was kind of, you know, not a lot of people have the experience I have in transplant plus in the industry. So the job itself was pretty, you know, the interview process was pretty straightforward. Learning how to work with a lot more internal teams is a learning curve. But it really just revolves back to relationships, you know. So my thing on relationships is you got to get to know the person who you're talking to. You know, you got to take yourself away. It's like, not what I need, is what does this person need, and how do I make that person successful? Because if people always want to be successful in their job, so being able to navigate that across all these different teams of what do you need to be successful, and how can I kind of help support all of that. So it's kind of changing your mindset of being able to, not what I want, is what they want. And so to me, that's what I did to kind of be successful, is to be able to transition from, I don't need anything, I need to make sure that they do. And then that's when those relationships are kind of formed. So learning also just kind of all of the specifics around how to run a clinical trial, especially at a large organization versus a small organization, differs. People are different, leaders are different. So kind of understanding that, you know, being able to navigate that whole aspect is a learning curve. But ultimately, you know, you get to understand kind of how things are working, and you within, you know, a few months, you kind of get yourself, but it takes a while. It takes a while. I always tell people, when you leave, you know, academia or wherever you're working and go into the pharmaceutical industry, it's a 6 to 12 month transition period. You know, it takes you time to understand all of the nuances kind of within the pharmaceutical industry. So it's not like you switch jobs and you go in, it's like, all right, now this is exactly how I was doing it before, and it's not. So I always say it takes about 6 to 12 months to kind of do that transition. Yeah.
When you were establishing your team and establishing the program that you'd have as a director of the medical science liaison program in organ transplant, what were the most important factors that you considered for providing information, as well as how did you conduct your team to make sure that they were promoting the products in compliance, but also making sure that providers understood their value?
Sure. So one thing you don't do is you don't promote. I mean, that's a compliance thing. Promotion is you know, on the sales side. Salespeople promote. We support. You know, that's on the medical science liaison side. We support. So the biggest thing, you know, you always, within an organization, you always come up with an overall strategy of kind of what you want to say and what you kind of want to do. So you come up with that overall strategy, and within that strategy, then you'll come up with different tactics, like different activities that you will do to make sure that what you're doing kind of covers that overall strategy, if you will. So the tactics, you got to make sure that everybody understands what they are, they know the material, they have the ability to kind of communicate all of that. So it's kind of multifactorial. You know, you got to have the knowledge, but you also have to have that ability to interact with other people. And I've always said that, you know, a lot of times you can teach people kind of how to become that interactive person, right? You gotta educate people on kind of how to do that. So you always want to look for that. You always want to look for people who are coachable, able to communicate with other people, those types of things as well. And then ultimately, you know, after kind of 3 months, so forth, you're always kind of checking in. What do you need? What do you need to be more successful? How can you be? What challenges are you seeing? Where can we address those? Because medical science liaisons bring in the currency, if you will, for a medical science liaison are insights from external folks. So gathering all those insights, making sure that you're addressing all the needs. You know, doing that kind of rehashing once you've kind of, done all that stuff and had people go out there and talk about it for a while. So it's kind of a consistent, overall loop. Good question. Yeah.
Can you talk about how you navigated learning like the business and money side of things, especially incorporating the Carolina Angel Network coming from a clinical background?
Yeah, sure. So actually, this is the investing side of things came from my dad. My dad, he didn't work in healthcare. He worked in computers, but he kind of always was into, investing, not like angel investing, but more like, index funds and things like that. So he gave me a book when I was at Carolina and I read it on index funds. And that just kind of made sense to me, right? So I kind of started off investing in just broadly diversified index funds. And if you're going to do investing, you don't start in angel investing. You start broadly diversified, index funds. That's my opinion, what you should really focus on. But I went to a liver disease conference. This is probably 2012. And Gilead at that time bought a company called Pharmacists for $11 billion for one phase 2 drug that was in phase 2 for hepatitis C. And that ended up being sofosbuvir, right? And so I'm like, why did this company pay $11 billion for this, one asset? I got to learn more about this. So then I got into more like biotech investing. So what I did is I took what I learned here at school and just evaluated data. And I would look into data. I would look at all publicly available clinical trials in and around that. And I would make educated decisions on whether I should invest in this biotech company or not. So again, and focusing kind of on what I knew in areas that I was comfortable with in publicly available data. So I did that. And the hepatitis C space at that time was just, on fire. So that was a good time for me to kind of start on that. And so that kind of gave me the experience to kind of get into that. But again, it's all based off, kind of what I learned, in school. And then after that, I went into the private equity space. And so then, got into, the angel investing, which is even more kind of high risk, high reward type of stuff. But again, more interaction. So it's been a kind of a stepwise fashion. So if you're interested in that kind of stuff, I'd be glad to talk to you about that as well. I have, a lot of times healthcare professionals don't have a lot of that experience, so that has been just my side hustle, if you will, of what I like. And it's fun, to me it's fun. So.
Well, I just want to thank Gordon for coming. He'll be up here if you have any additional questions, but thanks a bunch for your time.
Sure. Great. Thanks, guys.